The position of the medieval blacksmith or metalworker is often innately connected with that of the knight for whom he is immortalized, as supplying with a steady stream of swords and weaponry. To accurately describe this trade in the context of the medieval period, the blacksmith must be detached from the knight and analyzed as a separate entity. Essentially, it must be asked, what was there in the life of a blacksmith aside from hammering out swords for lords? What sort of world did he inhabit, and what were the rules he had to play by? A quote by Timothy R. Jones. So, let's look at Patrick Smith today, the father of Patty and Imel, husband of Olivia, and the best friend of Matthias Riddell.
Element, fire. Zodiac sign, Gemini. May 21st. Blood type, B. And by the way, it's no coincidence that he looks like the leading man actor, Jeff Bridges. And now Jeff was a lot more active in the 80s and the 90s, but some more recent things you may actually recognize him from would be as Obadiah Stane in the Marvel Cinematic Universe's Iron Man series. As a name, Patrick is of Latin origin, and it means nobleman or of noble birth. So, for all you Pats out there, y'all are the real kings, queens, and noble creatures.
Circa 800 to 1380s Common Era, blacksmiths were central to medieval times, often setting up shop in a place of importance in the center of the village. They would make not just weapons, but nails, furniture, locks, horseshoes, and armor. The blacksmith became essential to any town, and their techniques improved accordingly. However, the techniques became so advanced and arcane to outsiders that they were also sometimes seen as witches using forbidden magic to make strong weapons. Some blacksmiths were even burned at the stake.
Knowing what we know about witches now on this channel, since that was a big focus of last month, it kind of seems like the list of things that one could be accused of witchcraft just kind of keeps getting longer and longer, doesn't it?
Now, Carolingian records praise the high standards of blacksmiths and metalworkers. A royal decree or capitulary from 802 required that lords must have these workers to produce armor, most notably chainmail, for them on military campaigns. It was as a direct result of this exposure to conflict that the smiths were able to innovate and receive the most praise from their feudal lords. In medieval times, just as we see today, it's often during times of war that the most innovative techniques for technology and medicine are progressed so greatly. Because war never changes. But who were the Carolingians, and how did they relate to Scotland's blacksmiths? The Carolingian dynasty, a family of Frankish aristocrats, and the dynasty 750 to 887 CE that they established to rule Western Europe. The dynasty's name derives from the large number of family members who bore the name Charles, most notably Charlemagne. This way of life would be introduced in England and Scotland sometime around the mid-11th century, when William the Conqueror, also known as William the Bastard, the first Norman king of England and Duke of Normandy, signed the Treaty of Abernethy with Malcolm III of Scotland. Do you guys remember when I said that Matthias was Norman French? Now, the Carolingians were particularly impressed with the horse shields created for them, which would have afforded them even greater superiority in battle. These types of shields are the iconic ones we see in every fantasy story involving knights on horseback. It is easy to view these records as confirming the smith's commitment to producing the tools of war and to the sole employment of the lords who directed it. It should be noted that the records of Charlemagne pertain to warfare because that was his chosen emphasis. His tenure as the king of the Franks ran from 786 CE and later as the Holy Roman Emperor from 800 until his death in 814. After contracting pleurisy, saw him expand his territory with unprecedented success and maintain the loyalty of his nobles by promising the riches of annual summertime invasions into foreign territories. With such a heavy emphasis on conflict to establish and maintain his crown, it is no surprise that blacksmiths are recorded primarily as catering to this. We see here the conception of the blacksmith as primarily a producer of arms and armor that was to endure to the present day in both historical and fictional depictions. But this wasn't only limited to Charlemagne. Many cultures had famous or even mythical workers of the forge, from the biblical Tubal Cain, who is said to be able to alter the physical and chemical compositions of metals, which would also make him mankind's first chemist. Ptah, the god of craftsmen in Egypt, Hephaestus or Vulcan in Greek or Roman mythology, Kotarwakasis in what is now known as Syria, Tvastar from Hindu. In Slavic traditions, which much of Northern Ireland was at the time, Svarog was not only the god of forging, iron, and fire, but also the creator of all other gods in Slavic mythology. It is said this deity is the protector of blacksmiths and helps them cultivate their skills. Brigid was the Celtic goddess of the forge and also of poetry, healing, and protection, and domesticated animals. And I want to find a way to mention all of these because there's so many great stories about blacksmiths in the cultures of the world. Gofainan is Welsh, Wayland in Germany, Ogun from Nigeria, and Amakuni from Japan. And last but not least, the North pantheons Brock and Sindri, all great smiths with fantastic myths about their importance to ancient and medieval societies. Many rulers of the medieval era did recognize the other values of smiths to the extent that smith-produced goods such as armor and plate were among items counted as wergild. This was the price placed on every item and living being within the ruler's domain. It was the price that thing or person was worth if killed or injured, and had to be paid by the guilty party. This process required the intervention of a court to determine the outcome, and clearly places the work of smiths as being viewed as a physical value to the empire and as being able to serve a legal purpose. If someone was killed while wearing a smith's armor or their weapon broke, the guild that smith belonged to would have to pay a compensation to the aggrieved party. I can only think of all the good we could do if we could have these kinds of restrictions in places where so many weapons are manufactured and hurting civilians. In the modern age, away from the battlefield, the smith learned their skills from a master, who often employed several apprentices from a young age. Advancement from apprentice to master was by no means guaranteed, and rested entirely upon being noticed as a talented worker who was likely to be worthy of patronage or of lending money. This process was designed to forge the best blacksmiths, as well as to regulate the number of workers to reduce competition and preserve the prestige of the business. Masters were also unlikely to be lenient towards their apprentices, as it was only the master who would then suffer financially in turn. It's interesting to note that the basic parallels between smiths and this stage and the same process of advancement for young knights seeking recognition. The industry itself, like many others, assumed legitimacy by creating a guild that was administered by masters, which served the purpose for regulating the number of smith apprentices permitted and the materials allowed. In fact, we can see this exact process in modern life playing out in the way that doctors and lawyers who have to pass a bar exam to become practitioners. But contrary to the modern uses of gatekeeping the medical and law field, it shows an active attempt to prevent it from becoming saturated or exploited. It is clear that they served a societal purpose that was dependent of the production of weapons, which is why the attempts to formalize and preserve it. This was continued consistently into the High and later Middle Ages as blacksmithing assumed a major position in international trade. Evidence for this lucrative development can be found in the German city of Dinkelsbühl, which prospered largely in the trade brought in by its smiths. Further demonstrating the development of blacksmithing as integral to the medieval town and economy was the admission of their elite to the positions of authority within the region, such as the town council. This move represents a synthesis of the practice of blacksmithing and metalworking with legitimacy and recognition. Dinkelsbühl was one of the first such cities to implement this, granting smiths the right to stand on the town council in 1387. This official move reflects the city officials now recognized the blacksmith as an important domestic asset that was useful in international trade and civic development. On balance, the image of the blacksmith can't be totally separated from the feudal caricature that is endured, and this is because despite the establishment of smithing as a major aspect of the regional economy, it maintained a latent ability to provide for the military, and this can't be ignored. However, they also existed as separate entities with legal, institutional, and economical interests. Even in times of war, they performed other functions in society that were no less distinguishing features of their trade. Well, I can see how that's a lot. It's no wonder that Patty and Emil's father, Patrick, is always so busy. Here we see him hammering out some rough iron metal for the purpose of the most common item made by blacksmiths at the time, carpentry nails.
Grindstones like these would often be used with water in order to grind the metal to a fine point, sort of like he's doing here with the sword. This is also where the concept like whetstones would be used.
Now, Patrick himself is a fairly older man by comparison to Timothy or Matthias, around his mid-40s. As such, he's got a more weathered appearance, graying hair, and failing eyesight. An early depiction of Patrick actually had him wearing glasses. Primitive glass-blown lenses were used and set into either wood or leather frames, but seeing as the first pair of glasses didn't appear until the 13th century in Italy, the detail had to be removed. You can still find the original concept on Patreon if you want to have a look or work on your own coloring project. Medieval smithing in Scotland was not restricted to gender roles, and because of this, Patrick did end up having two, and only two apprentices, with his daughter Patty, but also Martin. Only one of them would prove to have the skill necessary in order to handle his family's business. When Patrick first came to the area that would be Alden, there was very little there except for a falling down forge and a small house down the river. Patrick first went down to that house where he met McTeague, a man he swore is older than time, and inquired about the building. Finding it had no owner, Patrick petitioned to buy the forge from the nobles of his area, which what drew Matthias' attention to Alden to begin with. Needing a fair core with which to build their village around, Matthias Riddell, Patrick Smith, Ewan McNamara Sr. and his junior son, and Ashley Campbell became the founders of the village. And this is a bit of a tangent, I know, but I think one of my favorite fictional blacksmiths has got to be Alvor from The Elder Scrolls V. I know it's an old game at this point, but I also appreciate how blacksmiths in that game would eventually sell house-building items like furniture and nails, affording the true air of realism in the game, where dragon fights are basically just debates.
So how about this blade?
You see those warriors from Hammerfell? They've got curved swords. Curved swords.
The exact origin of curved swords is something that's been debated for years. It is generally accepted that the majority of curved swords came from the East. Curved swords most likely manifested somewhere around Egypt, with the appearance of the khopesh, a weapon somewhere between a sickle and a sword. Since then, a number of curved swords began appearing in the East, and Westerners took to calling such curved swords scimitars. Technically, there isn't one sword that's called a scimitar. The term refers to an entire group of curved swords that came from the East, excluding the Japanese curved swords. The term may be derived from shamshir, which was a thin curved sword from Persia, although the shamshir wasn't really popularized until the 1500s. Other scimitars include the kilij, the Indian tulwar, think of massive cleaver swords from Aladdin, and you have a fairly accurate picture, somewhere between a shamshir and a kilij. Some smaller curved weapons from the east include the khopesh, a knife-like curved blade that probably was the predecessor to the khopesh, the Nepalese kukri, and the hooked-handed falcata from ancient Spain. Fantasy has had its own share of scimitars. Most notably, perhaps, is the dark elf Drist de Worden of the Forgotten Realms book series by R.A. Salvatore. Drist used two flashy scimitars when he fought, one in each hand, filleting his foes whenever he drew them. More recently, the Lord of the Rings movies show many of the elven characters wielding swords similar to scimitars. Despite being a very important character in the scheme of the story, Patrick doesn't have a lot of information to talk about. And now at this point we've added some additional information, and this became his bingo book. I hope the additional info was helpful in understanding blacksmiths better. For more art on this character, click the link at the end. Art for the TOA bingo book is provided by Shalak on Fiverr. We've included a link to their business down in the description, right above our Patreon link. Patreon is the best way to support this channel directly, so if you like our content and want to see more videos, head over there. Even $1 a month would be a big help and gets you access to some pretty interesting stuff. Current patrons include Shadowfox, Arya Gamari, Charles Tam, Jace Moreland, and Lundair Lumen.